All right, so a lot of research goes into trying to determine the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. Remember that in order for research to be strong, we need to be able to predict things. So, either predict if your attitude is going to influence and predict your behavior, or your behavior is going to influence and predict your attitude. So, to break this down a little bit, the first claim is that attitudes often predict our behavior. And the evidence or the terms that kind of fall under this would be central versus peripheral and mere exposure. So, in the central route to persuasion, it is more likely to predict your behavior than the peripheral route. This kind of makes logical sense because in the central route, how you formed your attitude was you put a lot of time and effort into it. You conducted your own research, you were sure to look at multiple points of view, and you didn't just take somebody's word for it. You didn't just look at a social media headline and say, yeah, that makes sense. Versus the peripheral route, which is maybe you took your friend's word for it, or your parents or guardians, or you saw some post on social media, or you just kind of in general formed an opinion and didn't really think much beyond that. So it makes me think of voting. Like if I put a ton of time and effort into determining what candidate I want to vote for, and I look at all their stances on issues, and then the weather's really bad. It's pouring rain, or it's freezing cold, or whatever. It's snowing, it's icy. I'm still pretty likely to show up at the polls and vote because I put so much time into it, and this is my one opportunity to do it. Where we tend to see lower voter turnout on bad weather days would be people who didn't really put as much time into it. They don't feel as strongly about the candidates. Maybe they just kind of have their opinion about voting from like parents or guardians or friends, or the feeling that they should vote, but they haven't really put a ton of time into it. And then the weather's crappy. That would be peripheral. We maybe wouldn't be as likely to show up and vote in that sense. In terms of the mere exposure effect, we also know that the more that you're exposed to something, the stronger your attitude is, and therefore the more likely that it is to predict your behavior. But there's a bunch of other stuff that we haven't talked about yet that falls under attitudes may follow your behavior. So the three kind of pieces of evidence here would be compliance strategies, cognitive dissonance research, and role playing. We're going to start with cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a term coined from a Festinger and Carl Smith study that was talked about in your book. It's the $1 versus $20. And basically what it says is when there's a gap or a discrepancy between your attitude and your behavior, it creates a bunch of psychological tension, and your brain does not like that psychological tension. It doesn't like dissonance. So instead, it's kind of forced to make a change in order to decrease that dissonance. And so you're either going to have to change your attitude or your behavior. So oftentimes with cognitive dissonance, I think of drinking and driving. I believe that 100% of us can say it's a bad idea to drink and drive, right? That's an attitude. But now let's say that I go out to dinner tonight and I have a drink with dinner, or I have two drinks with dinner, and then I drive home. And then when I get home, somebody asks me, like, hey, did you have drinks at dinner? And I would say, yeah, I had two drinks at dinner. And then they said to me, I thought you said that you believe that people should never drink and drive. So when somebody says that to me, it creates dissonance, right? It creates a gap between that belief, that attitude that I have, which is never drink and drive, and the behavior, which was to have a drink or two at dinner, right? There's a gap, there's a dissonance. So now what I'm most likely to do is actually change my attitude. I'm going to respond and say, well, I mean, people shouldn't drink and drive, but if you have one or two drinks over 2 hours at dinner, then that's okay. But people shouldn't drink more than that and drive. So I use that as an example because that's a common example that I hear all the time. With other people, dissonance might be created between eating healthy or dieting or working out, or being nice to others, or whatever else it might be. Okay, so that's cognitive dissonance. So another way that attitudes might follow behavior would be times where we're trying to get people to do things that we ask of them, and that's compliance. So compliance is how do we get people to follow along with a request? So there are a few different strategies here. The first one is called door in the face. This is where we ask somebody something that's so big that they're sure to say no, like slam the door in our face. And then we follow up with a request that looks smaller, but is the thing we actually want in the first place. So this makes me think of actually when I was in high school, I wouldn't have known that this was the strategy, but with my mom, door in the face worked all the time. I remember senior year prom. Prom was kind of cool because juniors threw it for seniors, like it was junior court or whatever, but it was like a goodbye to the seniors. So senior year, there were two different things going on after prom, and I knew which one I wanted to do. So I went home and I was like, "Hey, mom, so after prom this year, it's kind of awesome. Like we're gonna go to prom, and then we're gonna go to post prom, and then we're gonna go to Lindy's, and we're gonna stay up all night. The next morning, we're going to breakfast, and then we're driving to Great America, and we're gonna spend the whole day at Great America." And then come back and sleep over and probably not go to school on Monday. My mom laughed in my face and was like, absolutely not. And then I did the whole thing where I was like, I'm 18 years old, you can't control me, blah, blah, blah. And I stomped upstairs and I slammed my door shut, right? But that's not what I wanted to do anyway. So then I waited whatever the appropriate amount of time was and I ate dinner in my room. And then at some point later that night, I came down and sat on the couch and kind of used the silent treatment. And then eventually I said, so if I can't do the Lindy thing, then I guess a bunch of people are going over to Jimmy's house and just having like a campfire and pitching tents and sleeping in the field. So can I do that? And my mom said yes, which is ridiculous because clearly both of those are bad options. But anyway, that's what I wanted to do anyway, right? So the idea here of this compliance strategy is you ask something so big that the person is sure to say no, but then what happens in that interim is that they feel bad because people actually want to be liked. Your parents don't actually want to make your lives overly hard. So people want to be liked, but they just had a behavior that kind of made them look at themselves and go, God, I don't want to be a jerk. Like, this sucks. I feel bad that I'm disappointing them, but they're crazy. I can't believe they'd think that. So then when you come back with something that looks smaller, then they view it as you giving up a concession. And so then they change their attitude and kind of say, okay, well, I can let you do that thing because by comparison, it's not as bad. The next compliance strategy is called foot in the door, and it's actually just kind of the opposite of that. This is, imagine like a salesperson knocking on your door and you go to slam the door in their face, but they stick their foot in the door like, oop, oop, not quite closed. That's what foot in the door is. This is where they get you, you get somebody to agree to something that's small, and then after they agree to the small thing, then you increase and add on the other things that you might want, okay? So for this one, let's say that a friend asks you like, hey, my car's in the shop, would you mind picking me up in the morning for school? And then you're like, yeah, no problem, I can pick you up for school. Now, once you say that in your brain, whether you realize it or not, you are sitting there thinking, I'm such a good person. Like, oh my gosh, right? The behavior was saying yes, but the attitude is now like, I'm a great friend. People love me. People should want to be my friend. I'm a good person, right? You're replaying that. And then your friend says, awesome, I need to be picked up at 6:45 for a student council meeting. And you're like, right? Now I'm guessing most of you right now are like, yeah, then I'd say no. But the strategy itself hinges on the fact that we don't want to create like dissonance. We don't want to change that narrative about us being great people. So we tend to go along with that second request as well. The third thing on here is the norm of reciprocity. And this one just says that when we do something nice for someone else, they usually do something nice back. So reciprocity is just kind of like a give and take in relationships. So you know, if you borrow somebody money for lunch today, they'll pay you back tomorrow, right? So norm of reciprocity also is going to come into play with relationships, which is one of the last things that we're going to talk about. There's also a strategy called That's Not All, folks, but I think you guys can figure out what that is. Think of like a salesperson. And so with sales, they start small and they get you to commit to something. It's kind of like the foot in the door, but it's a little different because as you're looking at it saying, God, this is a really good deal. What a good car this is or whatever, but you're not quite sure yet. You're like, it's still too expensive. Then they offer like better financing. And then you're like, oh gosh, they're basically giving it away. And then they're like, and let me throw in, I don't know, name brand car mats and all of these things. And so they start throwing in things to what was already a pretty good deal. And so now you feel like, oh my gosh, they're basically giving this away. And you're more likely to say yes. The final thing then is what's called role playing, and that's a Philip Zimbardo experiment. Now, we don't just go through our day playing roles like in a play or something like that, but really, you're playing kind of social roles most of the time. Like I play the social role of a teacher, and then when I'm at home, I'm not a teacher. When I'm with my friends, I'm not a teacher, right? So you guys play the role of student, or you might play the role at work of being a coworker, right? So there are all different roles that we play. And Philip Zimbardo did some pretty solid research on this. So he's known for the Stanford Prison Experiment that you read about. Um, and what he found in this experiment was that when he randomly assigned people to the role of prisoner or guard, so that's the role, right? And they were enacting the behavior that they thought to be typical of a prisoner or a guard, their attitudes really started to change. They started to do and say things that they wouldn't do and say otherwise. So that's why role playing also falls under um, attitudes following behavior. So basically, just knowing what cognitive dissonance is, knowing the general compliance strategies and being able to like apply them to scenarios, and then having an understanding of Zimbardo and the Stanford Prison Experiment. Those are all important in and of themselves, but just know that in terms of organizing that information, it falls under attitudes following behavior.